Hello everyone, welcome to today's webinar, the HITRUST Assessment Handbook Series, utilizing the work of others in a HITRUST assessment. My name is Dennis Palmer, and I'll be your host and your moderator. As we go through the presentation, please feel free to enter your questions and comments in chat. The presentation and recording will be made available to participants a short time after completion of the webinar. In addition, we will follow up with any questions that are not being able to address during the webinar. I'd like to now introduce your presenters, Jeremy Hewald, Chief Innovation Officer, and Scott Crowell, Senior Innovation Officer, or Senior Innovation Manager. Sorry, Scott. Helps if I keep the page up to date. There you go, guys. There's your two presenters, and Jeremy, I'll hand it over to you at this point.
Yeah, I appreciate it, Dennis. Thanks. So today we're talking about using the work of others in a HITRUST assessment, and we'll talk about what that means in the webinar. Under that umbrella, we'll talk about inheritance. We'll talk about relying on third-party assurance reports like ISO certifications and SOC 2 reports. We'll talk about using the work of internal assessors and the option of direct testing controls performed by service providers in the service provider's location. And we'll wrap it up with some closing commentary and hopefully leave time for Q&A. And if you do have questions while we talk, do type them into the chat and we'll try to address them at the end. So what do we mean when we say using the work of others? Well, it's using the work of other assessors, other auditors, other inspectors to reduce the work that you have to do on a HITRUST assessment. Using the work of others is addressed pretty heavily in Chapter 12 of our assessment handbook, the HITRUST Assessment Handbook. If you follow that QR code on the screen, you can go to that assessment handbook and click around while we talk to get familiar with the content if you'd like. We'll also talk about concepts covered in Appendix 12 of that same handbook and a little bit in Section 7.3 dealing with carve-outs, and we'll talk about what that means. But I wanted to emphasize, like, this whole using the work of others concept is meant to avoid duplicative testing. And you might have, if you've been in the compliance or audit space for a while, you might be familiar with this on one side of the table or the other, where you're doing an assessment or you're about to get assessed, and you look at the scope and you realize that that control was just tested like 2 months ago. Like, for example, testing the terminated employee access removal process. You might be looking at a HITRUST assessment and say, look, okay, I get why that control is important to be in the HITRUST assessment, but are we really going to test it again? Somebody just sampled it and tested it and looked at all the tickets, and that control works and we can prove it. HITRUST allows using the work of other assessors to avoid duplicate testing, to hopefully avoid some of the audit fatigue and frustration that's associated with doing the same thing over and over and over again so often in quick succession, and it also saves time and money. So next slide there, Dennis. And on this slide, you'll notice at the top, there's kind of a funny graphic. It's got some highlights. What is this? So in this webinar, we'll be building a decision tree while we talk. And at the end of the webinar, we'll show the whole decision tree put together that hopefully you can use as a job aid or a practice aid if you'd like to. And throughout the webinar, I'll introduce different points of the decision tree and talk about concepts that are associated with each point, each decision. And as you'll see, the decision tree leads to a decision about how you are going to address the evaluation of a single HITRUST requirement. So this is meant to be done kind of on a per HITRUST requirement basis. After your assessment's been scoped and you know what your HITRUST requirements are, this decision tree will help you figure out, can I and should I use the work of others to evaluate this requirement, or do we need to evaluate it ourselves, like fresh? So it all starts with this consideration of who performs the HITRUST CSF requirement. Is it being performed in-house, or is it being performed by an external service provider, like maybe a cloud provider or colo provider, or maybe some kind of managed IT services provider? Next slide, Dennis. And so if we follow decision tree to the right and say, okay, for this requirement, it's being performed by an external service provider, the very next consideration is how are we treating that service provider's controls in this HITRUST assessment? And HITRUST allows two different options that are really similar to other assurance programs and other assessment types. We offer the inclusive method or the carve-out method. In other words, you can include in the scope of the assessment controls performed by that service provider, or you can exclude those controls from the scope of the assessment. The important caveat here when you're making this decision is HITRUST only allows for the inclusive method to be used on R2 assessments. In other words, if we do it in an R2 validated assessment, like trying to get a certification, you have to include those controls. You cannot carve those controls out on the basis of them being performed by a service provider. They have to be included in the scope. However, if you're doing some kind of readiness assessment, even an R2 readiness assessment or a I1 or E1 assessment, you have the option to exclude those controls being performed by a service provider. Yeah, so inclusive or exclusive, if you're familiar with like SOC 2s, very similar. These same options exist there. Dennis, next slide. So in this part of the decision tree, let's say we're going to take the carve out method. It's an outsourced control. We want to take the carve out. We can, maybe based on the type of assessment we're doing. What do you do? Well, in my CSF, you mark the requirement as not applicable, and you add the explanation of this is being carved out due to the fact that it's performed by so-and-so provider, and we're taking the carve-out method for that provider. Important consideration here as well is HITRUST does not allow sort of mixed carve-out for controls within a single provider's area. In other words, if the external service provider is performing many controls that are in the HITRUST assessment, then you can't carve out some of those controls and include others. You have to take either a complete carve-out approach for all controls performed by that provider or a complete inclusive approach for that provider's controls. And that is kind of explained in more detail in the handbook in section 7.3. Dennis, next slide. And yeah, okay. So Scott, you help us transition? Yep.
Sure. As you know, moving through this agenda, we're now going to talk about what we call inheritance, inheritance is one of the primary ways that assessors and assessed entities can leverage the control testing that's already been performed, which we talked a little bit about. Now, I'll toss it back to Jeremy.
Yeah, thanks. And Dennis, if you want to go to the next slide. Thanks for that, Scott. Yeah, like Scott mentioned, inheritance is it's the primary avenue that people are going to be doing using the work of others in the HITRUST world, just because it's such a robust piece of our machinery with really mature workflows around it. And we have a very healthy ecosystem of service providers that participate. And so it's really, really popular in our world and HITRUST assessments. But what is it? I like to think of it, inheriting a requirement is synonymous for importing a requirement. So if someone has already tested that requirement, I can import their assessment assessment scores into my own assessment. There's two types, depending on who is performing the control. And so in this decision tree slice on the left, we're looking at what inheritance would look like if the assessed entity is performing the control themselves, and you have the option to inherit from some other assessment that the assessed entity, that the organization has completed already. So real common in like a shared IT services environment, we'll see organizations say, all right, I'm going to do a HITRUST assessment against my shared IT services, get all that finished, and then my lines of business can do their own smaller HITRUST assessments against their specific area, and they can inherit internally from the shared IT services assessment. And on the contrary, we have external inheritance. And if you go to the next slide, Dennis, external inheritance is important whenever the control is being performed by a service provider that's outside the company. So the internal or external really indicates who's performing that control, the company or a provider. So in the external inheritance world, you have to ask yourself how much of this control is being performed by the service provider. Is all of it being performed by the service provider or some of it? And again, how much of the control is being performed by the provider? If that control is being performed by the provider in full, then you can use full inheritance. And if it's being performed in part by that provider, you can use partial inheritance. And we'll talk about some scenarios about what it means for a control to be fully or partially performed by an organization, by a service provider. But important thing on this side is you can externally inherit. This is the most popular type of inheritance, by the way. And you can inherit only part of the control scoring as well. Our assessment platform, ICSF, has all the math and logic to combine partial inheritance scores from multiple providers if it's a multi-cloud environment, for example, or if part of the control is being performed by the company and the other parts being performed by a provider. You can do many partial inheritance requests on a single requirement if you need to. So you got full and part, and you got internal and external. They're all under the inheritance umbrella. And again, this is all helping you use the work of another assessor instead of having to test the controls yourself during the HITRUST assessment. And so I think the next slide is Scott's.
Yeah, and so thanks, Jeremy. Now that we've learned a little bit about inheritance, you may wonder what tools we have available to help enable this process. And this is where the shared responsibility matrices, or SRMs, as we'll call them throughout this presentation, come into play. So these SRMs, they serve as the foundation or guidebooks that assessors and assessed entities are going to use during the planning phase when considering external inheritability. These matrices, once you kind of dive into them, they will clearly define which controls can be inherited, and they further specify the individual inheritability values that are assigned to each control. And when I say inheritability value, we'll talk about that throughout the presentation as well. When I say that, I'm referring to when Jeremy just mentioned full inheritance or partial inheritance. There's also a third, no inheritance. So if it's not inheritable at all for a variety of reasons, that's also an inheritability value. So from a HITRUST standpoint, we've created two sets of SRMs that are made available to users. The first one is what we call the HITRUST Baseline Template SRM. This document includes inheritability values for all HITRUST control requirements within all HITRUST versions since the beginning of time for HITRUST. So if you think about how many controls that might be, so that's a pretty large document. Really serves as the basis for the second set. The second set includes SRMs that we've tailored to certain third-party provider assessments, and these were created with the purpose of expediting the planning process for our users, so they can quickly review the exact scope and inheritability values for the assessments they plan to inherit from, instead of digging through a huge baseline SRM document. Currently, we have about 14 of these available for providers ranging from Google to AWS to Microsoft Azure. Go to the next slide, please. Okay, now that we've discussed in briefly what the SRMs are, we'll talk about how they should be used to enable the inheritance process, what the usage of them are. So during the planning process, as I mentioned before, the assessors and assessed entities, they get together, as y'all well know, to determine the scope and coverage for their assessment, and then they document that up front within MyCSF. Users can then turn to the tailored SRMs to determine which controls can be leveraged from the third party and what inheritability value they should be using for each control. given the agreed upon scope and assessment and the overall control ownership, the assessors and the assessed entities then work together to conclude on which requirements should be inherited, and they come to an agreement on the weight that should be assigned for each inherited requirement. Okay, next. Now we'll dive a little bit deeper into assigning reliance weights to control requirements, which I kind of briefly talked about in the last bullet point. So as stated here, weights are represented between 1 and 100, with fully inheritable requirements weighted at 100, kind of obvious, while partially can fall anywhere between 1 and 99. It's very important to note that just because a requirement within the SRM is listed as fully inheritable and can be fully inherited, it doesn't necessarily mean that you should be fully inheriting that requirement. You know, it depends on control ownership and your evaluation of that control ownership to see what part of the control you own, whether or not it's all or just some. And we'll look at a couple of examples on the next slide to kind of demonstrate this. Okay, so in scenario one, we have an organization. Well, the control is a physical security requirement. Very simplistic. The doors are locked within the data center. So in this scenario, you've got 4 in-scope facilities, with 1 being a colo. The other 3 are on-site, on-premises data centers for the organization. So in this situation, the way you would handle it would be an external inheritance request would be made of the colo provider at a weight of 25% for that 1 colo data center, or that would be partially inheritable, even though the requirement is showing as fully inheritable in the tailored SRM for that provider. So the corresponding 75% for the on-site data centers should be tested by their assessor. You know, this is the scenario I mentioned from the previous slide about what you can inherit versus what you should inherit. So moving on to scenario 2, we'll look at the same physical security requirement, but there's only 1 in-scope data center and it's a colo. In this situation, an external inheritance request will be made of the colo provider at a weight of 100% or fully inheritable. And so it's also important to note that in both scenarios, all of this rationale for inheritance must be clearly documented in your assessment narratives in MyCSF. Okay, we'll go on to the next one. So the next few slides contain a list of expectations and requirements for both sides of the external inheritance request process. Both sides being those making the external inheritance requests and the inheritance providers who receive the inheritance request. These are very list heavy, and so I'll try to just touch on them briefly. I think they are important, but it's also important to note that the full lists are contained with the assessment handbook and are applicable. So you should definitely review those when you have some time. But like I said, we wanted to touch on some of the more important ones. First, we'll talk about the requirements and expectations of those making the external inheritance requests. First, requests can only be made against active or unexpired, as we call them, E1, I1, or R2 assessments. Next, only testing from completed validated assessments can be inherited. That means you can't inherit from an incomplete assessment or a self or readiness assessment. All external inheritance requests must follow the approval workflow within MyCSF and be approved by the provider before they can be applied to the requirements in your HITRUST assessment. Continuing from the previous slide, we've got just a few more to discuss for this. Inheritance requests should be weighted appropriately and align with the expected inheritability values in the SRM for the provider being leveraged. So this is where the SRMs come into play, and you need to make sure that that analysis coincides with what is expected within the SRM. Additionally, these SRMs they shouldn't be used for scoring within the assessment. Basically, you should not just simply attach, and what I mean by that is you shouldn't just simply attach the SRM in your assessment and say, I'm good, that's my analysis. You have to evaluate each control requirement separately and follow the request approval workflow for each request. There is a time frame for request submission. Specifically, requests must be submitted prior to the end of the 90-day assessment fieldwork period, but no more than 30 days before the start of fieldwork to make them valid. And finally, requesters are expected to appropriately weight requests considering the amount of the requirement being performed by the provider. So basically, if you're that goes back to the weighting slides that we just discussed. So you need to make sure that those are appropriately weighted, because those do need to be approved by your external assessor, and they will be evaluated during the HITRUST QA process. And next. Okay. I'm moving quickly through these, so I apologize. But now that we've discussed, the requirements and expectations of those making the inheritance request, we'll talk a little bit about the same for external inheritance providers that they'll be receiving, reviewing, and hopefully approving the requests that are submitted. First, they must consent to and enable inheritance within their assessment. This is a flag that the providers will complete in their assessment within MyCSF to make them available for use by inheritance users. The expectation is that these providers will process these requests in a timely manner. So there are separate courses or trainings available that elaborate on the entire request process within MyCSF. But the expectation is that providers will process these requests quickly and timely. As part of the inheritance request process, providers also must validate that the users making the requests are valid customers. So that seems kind of logical, but they then, once they say, okay, this is a valid customer, they must then verify that the controls being requested for inheritance are within the scope of services that they provide to that customer. And then once they've decided that, okay, it is a customer, we do perform that service for that customer, they then need to look at the weight that is being requested to make sure that it's reasonable and it lines up with what they have in their SRMs. Basically, you want to make sure that they're not trying to overly weigh their reliance on that requirement. Next, providers are expected to engage directly with the users when there are questions or concerns related to inheritance requests. This means that HITRUST does not act as a middleman between the requesters and the service providers for these requests. So, and as I mentioned before, providers are, building on the timeliness, providers are expected to respond to all open audit inheritance requests before an assessment expires or is unpublished. Again, this builds on the timeliness of their responses. Again, as I mentioned previously, these full lists are found within Section 12 of the Assessment Handbook, and you can dive into them deeper at your leisure. Okay, next.
Yeah, Scott, if I can interrupt you for just a second.
Yeah,
we're getting a lot of good questions in chat. Please make sure you're addressing them to the panelists so that we don't end up with any inappropriate information being shared on these. And we are responding to these via chat, and also we'll catch up at the end. So appreciate everyone's input on those. Thank you.
This is where everyone checks their chat to see what inappropriate comments have been made. Is that what's?
That's exactly what's happening.
I just want to make sure that we get everybody to send them to the panelists. So because
that's part of the reason why we're trying to. I really am trying to hurry through some of these lists that can be reviewed in the handbook, so we leave a little time at the end for some of these questions. So
okay, we'll keep going then. Thanks.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for that, Scott. Yeah, and let's talk about the next section, which is relying on third-party assurance reports. So I mentioned inheritance is the most popular way in the HITRUST world to use the work of others. reliance on third-party assurance reports is the next most popular way. And so next slide, Dennis. There's a couple scenarios that you can find yourself needing to rely on a third-party assurance report, like a SOC 2 Type 2 report or an ISO 27001 certification report or a FedRAMP report or what have you. Again, if a control's already been tested really recently and it's in one of these reports, you can consider relying on it. It's got to be a valid report, and Scott will talk about some of the requirements that have to be met in order for that report to be able to be relied upon in a HITRUST assessment. But from a decision tree perspective, it's most common to rely on a third-party assurance report given to you by a service provider. So if you're in some kind of colo and that colo doesn't participate in the HITRUST inheritance program, but they do offer a SOC report, that SOC report might cover all the physical security considerations you need for the HITRUST assessment, especially like the smaller E1 assessment, for example. Or less commonly, maybe you are considering, okay, hey, this is a requirement that the organization, the assessed entity, just finished testing in their testing for their own SOC 2 or their own ISO 27001 certification effort. So maybe you'd be relying on the organization's own third-party assurance report as opposed to one given to you from an external provider. Yeah. Dennis, next slide.
All right, back to me for another list. So, much like other previously discussed lists, there are also, as Jeremy mentioned, a handful of requirements within the handbook that must be met when leveraging third-party reports. And so I'll briefly touch on some of those, again, understanding that the full list is available within the handbook. So first and foremost, I mean, some of these may seem fairly obvious, so bear with me, but these should be used. These can also be used kind of as a checklist as you get a third-party report. You say, can it be used? Let's go down the list of requirements and check off the boxes. So, first and foremost, a business relationship must exist between between that report and the organization. Basically, it would be inappropriate to rely on a SOC 2 report from a service provider that's not used by the assessed entity. So that kind of makes sense. The report being leveraged, it has to contain certain elements and really spell these things out, such as scope, the timing of the audit, audit procedures, the audit results, and any conclusions or exceptions that the auditor finds. The auditor publishing the report must be objective, independent, and competent to perform the testing and the testing within the report, the testing and issue the report. So basically it needs to be, somebody that's a reputable, competent firm that's performing the testing and issuing that report. That report must be less than a year old. So you can't use old reports to meet current requirements. That may not be a surprise to anyone either. And then also both HITRUST and the assessor must be authorized to receive the reports and review the reports. Okay, continuing from the next slide with some additional requirements. So the scope of both assessments must overlap, including things like the controls of the systems and the facilities that are included within the scope. In addition, a mapping must be prepared and provided in order to guide the HITRUST QA team through the rationale for this reliance. Next, the testing rigor must equal or exceed that of a HITRUST assessment. So you need to be performing the same steps with the same, things like sample sizes and performing walkthroughs and basically going through all the same steps. The report being leveraged must meet the relevant professional standards. For example, SOC or PCI. So if it's a SOC report, it has to meet all the requirements of a SOC report. It's a signed opinion. So it needs to, there are AICPA requirements and it must meet those requirements. And then finally, the corresponding work paper documentation that's associated with the leverage report must include certain items such as audit scope, focus, the coverage time frame, the scope mapping, and the procedures performed, much like, up above, that the report needs to include it and the work papers need to include that as well.
Yeah. And Scott, if I can add some commentary here, there's a couple things I see people trip up on a fair amount when trying to rely on a SOC report, and I'll highlight those real briefly. One is HITRUST doesn't let people rely on a gap letter or a bridge letter or like a comfort letter, you'll see it sometimes called, that tries to extend the life of the SOC 2 past the expiration of SOC 2. Again, that SOC 2 report, if it's older than 1 year, bridge letter or not, can't rely on it for the HITRUST world. Also, you'll find very commonly that the controls tested in a SOC 2 are not as prescriptive or granular as the controls tested in a HITRUST CSF assessment report. And so you might have a lot of intention and hope that you can rely on the SOC 2, but in reality, you'll run into a scenario pretty commonly that there are evaluative elements in the HITRUST CSF requirements that are just not covered anywhere in the SOC report, and therefore you can't try to get comfort on those evaluative elements or those aspects of the HITRUST requirements. It's not tested in the SOC report. There's no way to get comfort on it by relying on the SOC report. Thanks. Yeah, next slide, Dennis. Sorry about that. Back to you, Scott.
No. So the next option that we're going to discuss is placing reliance on testing performed by internal assessors, and I'll kick it back to you.
Yeah. You like my little agenda image? That's AI generated. We're cutting edge. But yeah, I said, hey, Google, draw a picture of what I should put on my agenda slide, and it drew an agenda slide. So anyway, I hope you like that. Next slide, Dennis. We're talking about the scenario where you kind of have to direct test an internally performed requirement. And this is super common, but to round out the decision tree, the point here is I've got a control that's performed internally. It's not outsourced. I cannot internally inherit the control because I just can't. Oops, Google, thank you. And I also can't rely on a SOC report. The company doesn't have one. And so what do? Well, you just test the control like normal, like the assessor would test it. Important to note, though, it doesn't necessarily have to be the external assessor that tests it. Like many other assurance programs, HITRUST also offers an internal assessor option that helps reduce the burden of some of the external assessors' work during their validated assessment. So Scott, talk to us a little bit about what it takes to rely on an internal assessor's testing in a HITRUST assessment.
Sure, and much like the other areas, there are certain requirements when you rely on internal auditors, assessors testing. And again, I'll just reiterate one last time. These are the full list is available in the assessment handbook. So, first, using an internal assessors testing is completely optional. It may not be a good fit for all companies. So, for example, companies that you must consider whether or not they have sufficient resources and expertise, to support that type of testing. Companies are allowed to use both internal and external resources to perform the testing, as long as they are qualified and independent of the function being assessed. Relying on internal auditors testing, it does take quite a bit of upfront planning by both the organization and the external assessor. This makes sure that everyone knows who is testing what, and everyone is also following the same testing approach. And internal assessors, they're allowed to test as much or as little as the organization can support. However, the external assessors also have certain responsibilities, such as they must participate in all the walkthroughs, and they have to reperform a subset of the internal testing. So you might think to yourself, why would I consider using internal assessors to perform testing? A few reasons come to mind that we have right here, and we'll talk about them a little bit. By using assessors internal to the organization, their testing can reveal gaps that can be immediately addressed and avoid surprises during the validated assessment phase. And I think that's probably the most important, in my opinion. But I'll touch on a few others. There's also a greater likelihood that an internal assessor would have a deeper understanding of the control environment and the controls being tested, meaning you'll get better, more thorough results through internal testing. And a byproduct of that would be, by using internal resources, you'll increase high trust awareness and literacy within the organization. The more internal folks that companies have that understand the framework, I think it's the better. And then finally, by supplementing the external audit team with internal resources, you kind of allow for staffing flexibility and certain scalability within the overall audit team. Okay, next. Okay, so the final and probably least used testing approach is directly performing testing of controls at a third party, and I'll toss it back to Jeremy.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. And so next slide, please, Dennis. So the scenario here is it's a outsourced requirement. It's performed by some service provider. Okay. And I know I'm taking the inclusive method. So like, for example, I'm doing like an R2 validated assessment where I have to take the inclusive method. Okay. And I've learned that I can't externally inherit this requirement. Maybe the provider doesn't participate in the inheritance program. And then the provider has also indicated that there is no third-party assurance report that they have made available, which covers the control. Well, what do? The last lever that you can try to pull is to say, okay, well, if you're not giving me any comfort on this control through a HITRUST assessment or another report, can we just go to your environment and directly test this control in your environment? Like, could you say to that colo provider, hey, colo provider, can we send an audit team out there and do this review? And if this happens at all, it'll be under the right to audit clause of the contract with the service provider, if there is one. This is really rare, though, because these providers don't want to have to entertain a bunch of bespoke audits throughout the year. It's much more efficient for them to do one audit, one assessment, and have many different customers rely on the results of that through the work of others program. But this is an option of last resort. We offer it. I have seen people use it. Again, it's very rare. The important thing to note here is when this happens, that testing has to be performed to the same level of rigor and observing the same assurance program requirements as if it was a control being tested in-house. So it's not like you're going to do a different level of lighter touch testing just because it's at the provider's environment. Nope, got to be the same level of rigor, timing considerations, all that, all have to align. And Dennis, next slide. So same kind of conversation, but let's say the provider says, nah, we're not going to entertain some other audit team right now. We can't. So what do? Well, you hadn't been able to get any other comfort on the operation or maturity of that control. You have to take a 0, unfortunately, given the lack of information. Why? Well, because if you tried to take any other score higher than 0, you'd be guessing because you just don't know whether that control is in place in that provider's environment. And in high trust validated assessments, we're looking for high assurance, high confidence, accurate results. And there's no guessing. Like, you can't guess at what the score might be. So you have to land at 0. And because it's inclusive method, you can't NA it out either. If you were taking the carve out method, instead of taking the 0, you could entertain like, well, maybe I'll just carve out this entire provider. But under this part of the decision tree, you've taken the inclusive method. You can't get the information the other way. Unfortunately, you have to land at 0. So I'll turn it back to Scott now to wrap us up.
All right, thanks, Jeremy. We've got now we'll get a little closing commentary and hopefully allow some time for some Q&A. So jump to the next slide. All right, so just to briefly recap a few of the key takeaways that we hope everyone's able to utilize during your assessment process. So first, HITRUST does allow for results from other assessments to be used and imported into their assessments, more commonly referred to as what we've obviously discussed as using the work of others. So that was one of the first thing we talked about that kind of kicked all of this off. Second, there are 3 key approaches we've discussed to accomplish using the work of others. And these are, first, reliance on third-party assurance reports. Next is inheritance, whether or not that inheritance is internal or external, partial or full. And finally, relying on testing performed by internal assessors. So, the overall goals associated with using the work of others, and probably the two things that resonate most with leadership, audit teams, and those being audited, obviously, are saving time and money and reducing audit fatigue, which I'm sure we're all very, very familiar with. So I'll now turn it back to Jeremy to discuss the consolidated decision tree that we've been building towards throughout the presentation. Jeremy?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. So I didn't want to show this whole thing put together at the start of the webinar because it is kind of busy. There's a lot of forks in the road. But by taking it in little tiny chunks and talk about kind of what each decision means, if you put it all together, I think it's a handy little thing that you can like take a screenshot of right now if you want, save, put in your back pocket, and the next time you're planning a HITRUST assessment, think about, okay, well, what do I do? Is there any opportunity to use the work of others here to avoid having to do a new fresh test of this requirement? And here's, again, the decision tree that you go through along the way. Start on the green, end on the orange, and there's a bunch of different testing approaches that you could possibly land on. And during the webinar, we're talking about how you would land on every single endpoint in this workflow. This workflow kind of doesn't hold up great when you have control performed by different parties. So like if it's part of the control is performed by one cloud service provider and maybe part of the control is performed by another cloud service provider, this isn't great at that. In that case, the best way to use this decision tree is to instead of looking at the entire requirement and walking it through, take each individual evaluative element in the requirement and walk through each individual evaluative element through this same decision tree. And then you'll be able to kind of approach the compound requirements and come up to the best work of others option for each evaluative element if work of others utilization is possible for that requirement as a whole. So hopefully this is helpful, and hopefully it made sense to kind of chunk it up and talk about little pieces before showing the whole thing. But again, hope that the people listening to this have benefit in the future from this little decision tree here. So I'll turn it back to Dennis, where I think we got time for questions.
We do. Great presentation, Jeremy. Great presentation, Scott. Appreciate your time this morning. So we did have, like I said, multiple questions come in over the course of the webinar. We managed to get a few of them in chat. What I'd like to do, give me just a minute here. I'm going to gather these, and then what I'll do is I'll read out the question and present it out to each of the different presenters for a response. So we'll get that going here in just a minute if you'll be just a little bit patient with me. And I do want to add, if there's other things that come up during the Q&A session, please feel free to enter those in here. We do try to answer all questions either on the session, or if need be, we'll follow up with a phone call or an email. But give me just a second here and we'll get going. Alrighty. So a ton of questions. I don't think we're going to get through them all today, guys, but so let me just go ahead and get started. The first one is, what type of service providers participate in the HITRUST Inheritance Program? I'm going to toss that one over to Scott, if you can just give me a quick response on that one.
Sure. We've got several of the larger cloud service providers, whether that's like I said, Google, Azure, and
AWS.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah, we can.
yeah, can't forget AWS.
Okay.
Yeah, we got all the big cloud providers. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, all the larger cloud service providers, and even some that are some of the more mid-sized. So I could give you a full list. The full list is available on the HITRUST website under the inheritance section. You can see which ones have published SRMs that are available for inheritance.
Yeah, and if I could add just a bit of clarity, so if you go back into your chat, I did put a link and the instructions on how to find those on both the website and if you're a MyCSF customer, where to find those in the MyCSF application. And that's going to be the tailored version that is for each different provider.
Yeah, and if you go to on the HITRUST website, it's actually a request submission. So the documents themselves are available upon request. So you'll have to complete a short form with your information, and then and then it will be provided to you.
Correct. Yeah, and like I said, for those of you who are in MyCSF already, those are available on demand. So I'm going to hit this one really quickly. Scott, this is going to be yours also. So if you publish for inheritance, if you publish for inheritance, are you required to publish a SRM, a tailored SRM?
You're not required to publish a tailored SRM, but most of them, most of the larger CSPs that have the majority of the approval requests do have tailored SRMs. And then what happens is those requests get submitted via MyCSF. There's a submission process, and there's a whole separate course and steps and to submit those requests. And then those go to the cloud service providers, who then either approve or they come back with questions about the weight. Mostly it will be about the weight, whether it's partial, fully inheritable, and they'll come back to you with either approvals or questions about why you're requesting certain inheritability values that may not be in the SRM. So.
Great question. This one's a really quick, and I'm just going to knock this one out because I know the answer to this one. So if you do publish for inheritance, do you have to respond to those inheritance requests? Yes, you do. If you publish your assessment for inheritance, you will see requests come in, and you are required to at least respond to them. Now, it may be, if they're not one of your customers, then it's a deny or a disapprove. But yeah, you would need to respond to those. So I'm going to go, let's see here. Jeremy, let's give you this one. So as it relates to the inclusive versus exclude approach, how would you approach a control with shared responsibility, and how do you document that?
Yeah, great question. So like I said earlier in the webinar, you make the decision of inclusive versus exclusive method at the provider level, right? And so, I don't know, let's say you've got some service provider and they're doing some of the control, and your own organization is doing the rest of the control, or it's a shared responsibility scenario where both organizations, you and your service provider, are expected to be performing this control, so that holistically the risk can be addressed, or holistically this control is being performed across the whole scope. Just because it's a shared responsibility doesn't change that inclusive versus exclusive method, but there is some thinking there. Specifically, if you've got a shared responsibility control, and in other words, if you've got a control that is partially inheritable and you're taking the exclusive method, you can carve out that portion of the requirement that is being performed by the service provider, but you'd still be required to get comfort or test or evaluate the rest of the requirement that's performed in-house. Or like maybe another scenario, you've got a partially inheritable requirement and it's performed by many different service providers. Like you've got multi-cloud and, I don't know, patching the endpoints performed by a great many different cloud providers, however complex it is going to be. You can still do that inclusive versus exclusive decision at the provider level as long as it's allowed by your HITRUST assessment type. Hopefully that's helped a little, and it leads a little bit into another question that was asked, a really good question. The question was, hey, HITRUST released some guidance recently around thinking of your inheritance request at the evaluative element level. How does what we're talking about affect that? And if you don't appreciate the ins and outs of that particular question, don't worry. It's a really in the detail question. Evaluative elements are just the different pieces of a requirement statement. So HITRUST, it's true. We did in release of SRM version 1.4.1, I believe, we included more detail about how different evaluative elements can be thought about in terms of, are they fully inheritable, partially inheritable, or not inheritable. That's true. We provided that to help everyone using the inheritance program understand all right, if you got a requirement that has a bunch of different elements in it, and you want to double click down and actually think about, okay, for this element, should I plan on trying to inherit, or should I plan on not trying to inherit, or is it partially versus fully, etc. That's still valid. However, MyCSF hasn't changed. So you're going to use the guidance that we gave around the evaluative element inheritability to form a requirement level inheritance strategy. So at the requirement level, MyCSF is still going to say at this high trust requirement level, is this requirement fully, partially non-inheritable? Like, what's my inheritance weights and all that stuff? So again, in MyCSF, you're not making inheritance requests at the evaluative element level. You're making them at the requirement level. And that was a really detailed question. It's a great question. So if everyone on the call didn't get every single piece of that, don't worry. It's a detailed question.
Yeah, and Jeremy, if I could offer just one piece to go along with that, for any of you who are current MyCSF customers, feel free to contact your customer success manager if you have any questions whatsoever on these. My name is Dennis Palmer. I'm the director of customer experience here. I actually do demos, and we call them tailoring sessions, and I do kind of one-on-one assisting if you have questions on any of the processes in MyCSF. We have a whole team here to help you out. So be sure to utilize that resource. We can do an optimization session, a couple other ways. So for any of these detailed questions, feel free to get a hold of your customer success manager. They're a great resource to help us out. We work with these teams directly. So if we don't know the answer, we're going to go to Jeremy or Scott. All right, and that actually, we did have a request to how you actually do those requests in MyCSF. Like I said, be happy to show you on a quick call. Just get a hold of your CSM or if you're not a customer yet and you want to see how that works, we have another team that could help you out with those also. We have the same capabilities to show you demonstrations of those capabilities. More than happy to help you out with those. Okay. Let's see here.
Yeah, you want to talk about I can talk about the 1 year criteria, Dennis, really quickly.
Yes.
There's some good questions
please.
on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I put a little bit of content in the chat as well, but to recap the question, it's a good question. When we were talking about relying on a third-party assurance report, like an ISO certification report or a SOC 2 report, how does that 1 year old how do you determine the 1 year old cutoff? Like, is this report too old to try to rely upon? How do you answer that question? In the assessment handbook, in paragraph 12.3.4, it talks about how to do that, and it explains that there's different types of third-party assurance reports that you might be trying to rely on. Some reports, like a SOC 2 report, are going to be a period of time report, so it's got a really defined assessment window, starts on this date, ends on this date, while other reports are an as-of date. So this information in this report is as of X date. And then other third-party assurance reports might be forward-looking, like a HITRUST certification is forward-looking. It's valid as of the date it was issued and either a year or two into the future. Right? So how you determine the end date of a third-party assurance report starts with understanding which of those three types of reports is it? Is it a point-in-time report? Is it a future-looking report certification? Or is it a period of time report, like in the past, like a SOC 2? And depending on the type of report, that's going to change how you determine the answer to the question of is it too old to rely upon. The future-looking one's really easy. If that future expiration date has not passed yet, still valid. If it has passed, it's not valid. And if it is a period of time report, like a SOC 2, you're going to look at the end date of the opinion period and then say, is that less than 1 year old in the past? If so, if it's less than 1 year old in the past, it's still new enough to try to rely upon in a high trust scenario. So again, this is in the handbook and it's a detailed explanation, but it's a really good one. And I wanted to spend time on it because I see people mess this up from time to time, and it is something that our high trust QA team looks at. So you want to make sure you're not running afoul of this requirement. because it's harder to respond to in QA, it's better to actually avoid the problem altogether by making sure you're getting the newest and correct report during the assessment window.
All right, thanks, Jeremy. I'm doing a quick run through here, and we are running really close on time. Let's see.
Yeah, Joe asked a question around physical security and whether, like, does the corporate facility need to be scoped in? Dennis, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we did a webinar as part of this HITRUST Assessment Handbook webinar series that talks about scope and answers this question.
We did actually. It's a pretty good session. Yeah, so if you're registered for this webinar series, we have 5 of them, and the previous one I believe is the one that covered scope of the assessment and how to make those determinations. Additionally, if you do have other questions more detailed and need some clarity on that, feel free to reach out to if you're going through QA or you're actually in the process of that right now, you'll have a QA team member that will be assigned to do these functions, and they can help explain what should and should not be based on their understanding and your explanation of what was included. But our previous webinar does have that. I haven't had a chance to look to see whether we have it up on the web. All of these webinars are being recorded, and we will have the sessions at the very end. We will post them and the slide decks up on the web for you to review. Yeah, if you have individual questions, either contact your customer success manager or support, and we can get you to the right resource to talk through those conversations. It also depends. One of the reasons it's not easy to say yes, no, or should or shouldn't be is depending on the type of assessment you're doing. In some cases, we talked about the inclusive or the exclusive method. Some of those will kind of change your answering on what can be or should be excluded from scope. Yeah, great questions. And we are about 1.5 minutes out. Jeremy, if we don't have anything else, I'd like to take just a minute so we can close out. Anything else you want to hit real quick?
No, just again, if you ask a detailed question that's specific to your own circumstance and we didn't answer it here, do reach out to your HITRUST CSM or Dennis, because the question might warrant just have a conversation to understand really your scenario in detail before HITRUST gives a response.
Exactly. Yeah, and there's a whole team of us here, and depending on which section it goes into, we'll get you the right resource. So at this point, we're about 2 minutes out, so I'm going to go ahead and close us out. I do want to thank Jeremy and Scott for their time here on the call and the great presentation they provided for us. This is part of a webinar series. There's 5 in this series. This is the 3rd. We have 2 more coming up on successive Tuesdays at 11 o'clock Central. So we'll have another session coming up in a week. The sessions will be available on the website where you register for these at some point, probably after all these are completed for review. I do want to thank everyone for attending the webinar. If you have questions, please feel free to contact your HITRUST customer support manager, or HITRUST support will be happy to assist. The presentation and recording will be available where the registration was completed. And if you have any questions on getting a hold of any of that content, please let your CSM support know, and we'll let you know when it's available and where to go find it. And with that, I would like to thank everyone for their attendance today. Hope you all have a great day, and we'll see you soon.